Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the IHR Latin American History Seminar. And thank you to those of you who have found your way here after various room changes. And hopefully everybody online can hear us and see the screen. We're delighted to have with us Michael Goebel from the Free University of Berlin today. Oh, there's a message in the chat which I hope is saying you can see. Excellent, thank you, Tom. From the Free University of Berlin, where he is Einstein Professor of Global History. And today we're going to be hearing about some of his more recent work and microhistory of inequality, immigration, race, and real estate in 19th century Buenos Aires. Now, there'll be Q&A afterwards for the people in the room, and also we'd like the people on the line the opportunity to ask questions. The easiest thing might be to put them in the chat, and I can manage those here in the room. Otherwise, you can raise your hand using the little hand raise button. But as it is, we will have the presentation and then we will sort out the Q&A afterwards. Okay, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much for the kind invitation and the introduction. And like Bill said, this is all very recent work, fresh from the archives, so to speak. It's part of a larger project of which Jürgen, for instance, also is a part, which started being interested in the global history of ethnic segregation in 19th century port cities. My part in this larger project was to study Buenos Aires. But as you will see from the following talk, it developed into more of an economic history project, which increasingly became interested in the history of real estate. Although what I'm going to say today follows on from this earlier interest in the history of ethnic segregation. So I eventually want to make a few larger points. First of all, about the history of segregation in 19th century Buenos Aires in global comparison. And second, about the history of real estate and what may be called racial capitalism, and what it has to do with Atlantic migration patterns and inequality in particular. So that's the larger analytical aim at the horizon. But the way the talk is structured is a little bit unconventional in that I'll jump straight into individual stories and the archives, so they hopefully bring to light what kinds of sources I'm using in order then to eventually land on a broader conclusion, which again has to do A, with the history of urban segregation, and B, the history of Atlantic inequality in the 19th century. All right, so the story I'm going to tell you, and this doesn't move the way I hoped.
You might need to use the mouse.
No. There it is. Yeah. Okay. So the story begins in Noli, which is a small town in Liguria, about 50 miles southwest of Genoa, which in 1911 looks roughly like this. But the story begins in 1842, at which point a man named Sebastiano Gandulia sells a very small and cheap property in the mountains behind the fishing village to someone else. He comes from an illustrious family in the town, but an impoverished branch of it. He's himself illiterate. The property he sells is worth extremely little, so he's not a wealthy person. And again, like I said, illiterate. However, a few years later, he pops up in the 1855 census of Buenos Aires as Sebastián Gandulia with a double L. And as you can see here, people online won't see my pointer, only people in the room. The census of Buenos Aires of 1855 specifically mentions that he's from Noli, and there's different ways of why I know that it's the same person. Now, in that census, he's part of roughly 90,000 inhabitants at that point. which have all been digitized in this census by the website familysearch.org, which is a Mormon enterprise. And so basically from that digitization of all the individual entries in that census, we started doing a lot of work mapping things in Buenos Aires, as well as in terms of the background of the European immigrants that at that point you have in Buenos Aires, of whom Sebastián Gandulia is one. So we translated this into an Excel sheet, like you can see here, and then mapped the communes of origin of all the people in that census who tell us where they were born, and so the municipality, which basically looks like that in the 1850s. So you see 3 clusters of origin. Let's say one is Liguria, the next one is the Basque Country, and then the third one is Galicia. So Gandulia, the person I just spoke about, is part of the highly localized migratory network. In the case of the place where he's from, Noli, part of an earlier migratory network that connects Noli and other small towns in Liguria to the Spanish port of Cadiz, and then via Cadiz onto the Americas. And he, I believe, is very clearly also not the only one who, in the process of migration, sells or mortgages his property, right? So if you look at the 19th century history of migration to the Americas, there's for very long been an assumption that this concerns primarily property-less people, and this is not the impression that I have from tracing people who have been found in the 1850s in Buenos Aires. For instance, if you go in the French archives, which concern the Basque Country, you see a lot of these notarial documents in which people mortgage their houses in order to pay for the passage to Argentina. Conversely, on the other side, in Buenos Aires, you can also look at more closely via the census what people are doing, where they settle, and so forth. In that same census, again, he's listed as a comerciante, so technically a merchant, but like I told you, he's illiterate. It essentially means a small-time grocer. And he lives in what then is by far the poorest part of the city, which is the southwestern outskirts. At that point, the city, like I said, has roughly 100,000 inhabitants. He there owns a business which in contemporary records would be called a pulperia, which is something like a grocery store, but they, and that will become important later, also act as pawnbrokers. And in these peripheral poor parts of town, they're typically the only business in place, owned by very often in this neighborhood people from Liguria. Again, how do we know this is the poorest part of town? It's the one that, according to the census, has the lowest literacy rate. But there's also other factors like real estate. I'm going to talk about this in a second, that you could go into and show what kind of neighborhood this is. So here's an extract from 1854 business census of the city, which in fact lists him as the owner of a pulperia. Which are businesses typically located at street corners who in contemporary lithographs look roughly like this. Now, what I eventually increasingly did when I grew interested in real estate was to look at tax lists from the same period, in this case from 1855, which lists all the real estate owners in all of the city and offer a specific evaluation of how much the property they own is worth, which you can see here on the right. And there, in fact, Sebastián Gandulia shows up twice. So, in fact, by 1855, which is about 10 years after his arrival in Buenos Aires, he already owns 2 small houses, which are directly adjacent to each other. And again, in the part of town where real estate is cheapest by far. which is the southwest here. In fact, on average, almost 20 times cheaper than properties near the Plaza de Mayo, which is the old colonial center. And by the 19th century, also by far the wealthiest and most powerful part of town where the elite lives. If we go into an 1870-72 cadastral map, which for the first time tries to picture every single house in the city, we can trace even more closely what happens in real estate and what kinds of properties this person, Sebastiano Gandulia, owns, namely these two, again, characteristically on the corner, which monopolize business in these kinds of peripheral neighborhoods in the outskirts. If we look at this more broadly, this neighborhood of Montserrat, that's the name of the church, you can see a lot of people from the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, who own these corner properties. And in fact, that's how they monopolize the grocery trade, but again, also act as pawnbrokers in this part of town. There's also a few other European immigrants, in particular from the Basque country, but they are a little bit less important in this particular part of town. Now, apart from the European immigrants, who were the neighbors of Sebastiano Gandulia when he moved to the outskirts of Buenos Aires in the 1840s? Going back to another census, this time from 1852, which hasn't been digitized, but which in contrast to the census 1 year later asked a question about color, it shows that quite a few of his neighbors are recorded as black, or in the terminology of the census, sometimes negro, sometimes moreno, sometimes pardo, and so forth, but essentially of African descent, as well as in many cases, and that's interesting, of African birth, as you could see here, where the nationality is specified, essentially by listing different African ethnicities. So moving back to the census that we originally used, which is the one from 1855, and then trying to map every single African-born person in that census, it eventually looks like this. So all the turquoise dots are one individual African-born person recorded in the census of 1855. Like I said, that was my initial interest about segregation, and that was also what I was initially surprised about when looking at the global historiography of segregation. Just how much in the middle of the 19th century, when slavery was formally not even abolished yet, it was abolished in 1861 in Buenos Aires, although at that point very few formally enslaved people are still formally enslaved. But so even before the formal abolition of slavery, you get something like a neighborhood in which the population of African descent concentrates, which is precisely this area where Sebastiano Gandulia opens his pulperias, and which is also the reason why I became interested in him. There's basically strong residential concentration of the African-born population. You can capture this in so-called segregation indices and so forth. I'm not going to go into this here, but for various reasons, I was surprised by this extent of residential concentration at that point in time, in particular of the African-born. Now, eventually, and this is how the story developed, I got the hang of it, how much of this residential concentration has to do with obtaining properties in this neighborhood, right? So like Gandulia, many of the African-born people are also listed as property owners or as capitalistas, as this text calls them, in that same neighborhood. So they own the houses in which they live. If we look at the census of 1855, in fact, it almost looks as if the African-born have the city's highest homeownership rate. There's a few problems here, right? I'm actually measuring owner occupancy, which is different from pure ownership. It's only the African born, but I control for age, right? So we only look at the population above the age of 40. There's different ways of looking at this, but essentially, whichever way we look at it, it is surprising to which degree the African born, but also Afro-Argentines were homeowners in Buenos Aires in the 1850s, clearly more often so than European immigrants. So that was something that surprised me, and which I think essentially explains this concentration in space that I observed earlier. So if we zoom into this particular neighborhood of Montserrat, or part of it, which I look at, and insofar as I can reconstruct the race of homeowners by 1855, it roughly looks like this. The gray houses are cases in which through the various sources I use, I cannot really determine with certainty whether the homeowner is white or black. Now, this doesn't mean very clearly that the black homeowners are wealthy people, right? Not at all. So it's very important to know, first of all, that homeownership in 19th century Buenos Aires is not necessarily associated with wealth. And the properties they own are different kinds of properties and are also worth very different values compared to white homes. So these neighborhoods that I showed you on the map, roughly by 1870, look often a little bit like this. The black-owned homes, in the census, are often called ranchos de paja, so something like straw huts in English. And in early photographic representations, they are not exclusively owned or occupied by black people, but they are typically rendered in photographs like this, although this specifically says rancho de inmigrantes, acriollados, right? So assimilated immigrants, basically, in this. I'm not exactly sure which neighborhood this is from, but it is meant to give you an impression of the building structure. And from a much later photograph, I think, looks often like this: adobe walls, straw huts, built not necessarily adjacent to the street, but a little bit in the middle of the lot, which they purchased initially, and so different kinds of building structures. And like I said, in the tax evaluation, the black-owned properties are on average worth a quarter of white-owned properties within this poor neighborhood, right? So I'm not comparing all of the cities, just within this poor neighborhood. The black-owned properties are worth a quarter on average. And in fact, I'm going to come back to this, right? So in the same neighborhood, you get wildly divergent values of the properties, properties that are immediately adjacent to each other. Now, but still, they are formally the owners of these houses, and people often ask me, well, to what extent do they possess the deeds? And we can go into this later, but my short answer is they do, right? So this is not a question of informal holdings, of squatting, or of what the neo-institutionalist literature tells us about the lack of security of property rights in Latin America as a driver of inequality and so forth, right? So they pay taxes, they own these properties, they have the deeds, they're clearly visible from all sorts of serial sources as legitimate owners of these properties. Now, like I said, these properties are initially worth not very much. And one reason that is important to understand how they obtained these properties in the first place is that in the early 19th century, compared to almost all other countries you can think of, Argentina is characterized by an extreme abundance of land and an extreme scarcity of labor, which basically translates into you having to work very little to buy one of these properties, in particular at the outskirts of town, where prices are a lot lower than in the center. Now, This is the situation by the 1850s. Then massive European immigration sets in, and things change dramatically in terms of urban growth, in terms of demography, in terms of housing shortage, but also as a result in terms of the values of real estate. Right. So as the city grows, particularly because of European immigration, these Black homeowners who own initially very cheap properties suddenly find themselves sitting on increasingly valuable real estate, which in theory should be great, right? So basically you own and you have the deeds of real estate amidst a housing shortage that eventually really reaches biblical proportions. Tremendous real estate boom that in fact spills over, or at least is connected to a sort of global financial crisis of sorts in 1890 and so forth. I'm not going to go into this, but things dramatically change. Above all, demographically, right? So this is merely the demographic development of the city. Sebastiano Gandulia arrives early. This is the census I mostly use in 1855, and it's after that that things explode, right? And so does the city spatially, which has no impediment whatsoever to horizontal growth into the open grassland westwards. The star is where Gandulia owns his two pulperias, and the city basically grows over this. So by 1916, this is a pretty central part of town already. And I'm not going to go into the details, but real estate prices in that area explode. So the question is, what becomes of the Black homeowners who by the 1850s, again, formally own so much of the real estate in this square, when look at it in most detail through the variety of sources that I showed you. So again, this is the situation of home ownership in 1855, insofar as I can identify the race of the homeowner. And this is what it looks like 15 years later in the tax list in 1870. And you basically see whether the 1855 owner managed to retain the home, whether the home in 1870 belongs to someone who is an identifiable family member of the owner in 1855, right? So this is basically about family retention. To what extent are the owners of 1855 able to retain the property in their family, and to what extent do they lose it? And there's a massive racial differential, right? So the Black the Black owners of the 1850s essentially lose their property twice as often as the white owners. And so now it becomes a bit complicated. I'm running multiple regressions on this. And we can talk about this later, but to cut a long story short, the short answer is the race of the homeowner in 1855 is the best predictor of loss versus retention in the following 15 years, right? So you can be poor, you can be illiterate, you can be or gender, marital status, the value of the property, all of this matters a lot less than whether you're Black or not. And so this eventually became a story about dispossession and trying to explain why these Black homeowners lose their properties at a moment when it's especially bad to lose the properties, and when I think they know it's bad to lose the properties. Why? Because even though they're overwhelmingly illiterate, they go to see notaries in very large numbers in order to make sure that these properties are transmitted onto the next generation. And that's exactly the process that very often fails. And so the project increasingly became one of being about what are the impediments to intergenerational transmission that explain the dispossession of Black homeowners here. And so I go into these testaments and in probate court proceedings and so forth, and it's all very complicated. I'm gonna cut this down a little bit. The Afro-descendant community has a demographic problem, which has to do with very high mortality in military conflicts and also very high infant mortality. So you get a lot of testators who say, yeah, I have the son, but he went to fight in the Guerra Grande in Uruguay, and I don't know if he still lives. And also, I gave birth to an additional 5 children, of whom 4 died within the first 3 months, right? So, and all of this, of course, is a problem for intergenerational transmission, but I think there's more to it than that. In some cases, like this woman from the same neighborhood, Catalina Acosta, I have women testators who bestow the property to the family of their former enslavers. And in this case, she actually bequeaths the property to the former enslaver of her husband, who happens to be a famous guy in Argentine patriotic history called Tomás Guido, right? A hero of independence and so forth, who enslaved Catalina Acosta's husband, and she bestows this property to him. Question is why, right? And this basically has something to do with murky ways in which formerly enslaved people obtain these properties through various contracts that oblige them to continue to work for free in the service of their former enslavers. And at the end of these contracts, they're then being rewarded formally with these properties, who then upon their death, via testaments, they bequeath on the families of their former enslavers, right? So things like that are happening also. But that's not the majority of cases, right? So most testaments actually aim at transmitting these properties onto their own children, and apparently it very often fails, right? And so I'm still trying to figure out why. One typical mechanism is that the heirs sell. And that's usually if you have more than one equal heir, of whom then one does not live in the property, wants to get the money, and the other one who lives in the property doesn't have the cash, and so they're obliged to divide the property and sell in order to pay out one of the heirs. Question is, why does this happen to the black owners so much more often than to poor white owners? And I'm still trying to figure it out, right? We can talk about this later. All right, now let me jump a few of these things and then see what eventually happens and come up with a few larger conclusions. Now, who are the beneficiaries of black dispossession? Well, people like Gandulia, who again, appear as capitalists and all these lists, but are not wealthy people. So he's an illiterate corner shop owner who, like I told you, in 1855 owes these 2 immediately adjacent pulperias, and in 15 years later owns 8 properties. And there's a few more Gandulias in the neighborhood who clearly also are from the same town in Liguria and related to him, who also basically speed up properties in that neighborhood. And so it's essentially, or by and large, Italian immigrants who end up with the formerly black-owned properties in that neighborhood. How do they do it? Well, in the case of this particular person, Gandulia, but also a few others, I think it has to do with the fact that as pulperos, they also operate as pawnbrokers and essentially monopolizing business in the neighborhoods. Their neighbors get indebted to them, and upon the neighbor's death, they kind of seize parts of the properties through these probate court proceedings in which someone steps forward and says, so-and-so owes me this number of money, and so now a part of the house belongs to me. And I see that happening quite often. So for instance, with this guy, Luigi Maffei, who's the son-in-law of Gandulia, who in 1874 comes forward, presents a grocery tab of his neighbor Josefa Zavala over the sum of 4,700 pesos. So which are just, simple groceries that she shopped in the course of 5 months, like woods and milk and, no luxury watches or anything. But the sum of that she basically spends in the shop over a mere 5 months amounts to a fifth of the value of her house, right? So which basically still shows you something about how relatively cheap real estate still is, but which also exacerbates the possibilities of expropriation of other people laying their hands on it. And finally, today, there's a real estate. I called and tried to, could you look in the attic? But there was no. I don't know if they're related. I chose the surname Gandulia because it's not a very common surname in Italy. It's very common in this one town of Noli. And it's reasonably common in Buenos Aires, but not so rare to make it certain that these are actually descendants of the person I look at. Now, if you look more at the level of popular culture, the Italian Afro-Argentine competition is very discernible for instance, in Afro-Argentine carnival songs. Here it's more about jobs than it is about real estate. But there's clearly a competition over turf going on precisely at the time at which this possession happens that I look at. One advantage that European immigrants have over Argentines, poor Argentines in general, is that their consular apparatuses step in to take care of certain parts of their business transactions. It's much more extreme in the French Basque case, just because the French state has more resources than the Sardinian state. But if you go through consular records in either Turin or Nantes, they constantly speak about the laws of succession in Buenos Aires and how the consulates should build an apparatus of notaries in order to help the immigrants with their business transactions, which in the French case very, very often concern real estate in the places of origin, right? So the most typical documents I see in all the consular records of the French consulate in Buenos Aires in the 1850s is proxies in which Basque immigrants in Buenos Aires commission or permit to someone back in the Basque country to deal with the inheritance of property in the Basque country. So, and this will now eventually lead me into the broader conclusion, which has to do with the relationship between business decisions and real estate market developments in the place of origin, so mostly in Liguria, and the place of destination, which is what I want to land on in a second. All right, let me finish with a few words on four, but especially two broader topics that I'm interested in. And the first of these, like I told you, was segregation and in particular residential patterns, which was what I was initially interested in before understanding that the surprising degree to which the population of African descent in mid-19th century Buenos Aires was concentrated in a particular neighborhood was the outgrowth of their acquisition of real estate in that part of town, which was counterintuitive for me coming from the literature about segregation that is informed by the history of the 20th century United States, where segregation, of course, is all about lack of access to real estate. But it's also very often about specific legal mechanisms which are segregationist by design, most famously redlining and the so-called restrictive covenants. And that kind of deliberately segregationist legislation you don't really get in mid-19th century Argentina, right? So this works differently. I was also surprised by the extent to which I found segregation, because Buenos Aires in the mid-19th century is still a reasonably small city of 100,000 inhabitants, without much public transport, of mixed use, which means people mostly live where they work. And so a lot of the usual suspects that for the 20th century United States have been cited as the main drivers of racial residential segregation are absent. And by contrast, I think one of the driver is, or the main driver is, the extent to which they're able to obtain real estate in the course of the decline of slavery. So essentially, real estate is what drives, statistically a high segregation index. Later in the century, that segregation index, which measures residential distribution, falls, so which formally from a sociological viewpoint would be called desegregation or integration, but in fact it's the outgrowth of the dispossession, right? So that was one of the mechanisms I was initially interested in, largely because I thought it was counterintuitive to how the history of segregation is often being narrated, for instance, in books like these. And I don't want to go so much into the details of migration history and settler colonial studies and capitalism or racial capitalism here, but I do want to say a few more words about what this entire story that I've been telling you, I think has to do with the relationship between globalization and inequality. Now, again, so the story I'm telling here is one about how Black homeowners in the course of the decline of slavery obtained property and were then being dispossessed or lost it, mostly to Italian immigrants in a particular neighborhood. Now, if you follow books like these, and in particular, well, actually, books like these, inequality in global history tends to be narrated either as a history of an aggregate of within country inequalities, right? That's basically Piketty's line. So we look at various countries over time, but always look at inequality within one country, or we look at between country inequality over time, which is more what Branko Milanovic does. Now, like I told you, one of the main reason I think why formerly enslaved people are able to purchase these properties is because in the early 19th century, Argentina is still such a land abundant and labor scarce country, which means you have to work not many months to buy these very cheap properties. Now, in the course of the 19th century, because of immigration, this changes, right? So real estate in the city becomes scarcer and labor becomes more abundant. Now, that's an old story of transatlantic economic history in relation to migration, which, like the literature from which I have these graphs, Kevin and Workey and so forth, has pointed out to the extent to which wage rent ratios in the countries receiving immigrants, here Argentina and the United States, fall, whereas the opposite happens in Europe. If Piketty saw that, he would probably or should immediately predict massively rising levels of inequality in Argentina in particular, but also in the United States. Why? Because this wage rent ratio, especially in the late 19th century, is falling, which means that wages become less important than the return on capital for the economy, right? And it's basically equivalent to Piketty's essential formula that the return on capital outpaces growth. So if wages become less important and the return on capital becomes more important, you should get massively rising levels of inequality, and probably Europe should be on the opposite trajectory here. Now the graphs, like you can see here, I just pilfered from the secondary literature, and they are not very useful. They're too late for my purposes. National aggregates in general are not very useful for me, because really what I want is something for Liguria in particular, and I want it for earlier, but they're meant to describe the general tendency of what economic historians have said happens because of mass immigration. And what Piketty would say about that is my inference, right? But I think that's that would be the message. All right. Again, like I said just now, the national aggregates, plus I don't have Italy, unfortunately, which I would like to have. The national aggregates are not very useful because immigration in the mid to late 19th century is so highly localized, as you can see from this map again that I showed you earlier, right? So if you zoom in to particular places, for instance, I looked from the Basque Country as these military recruitment lists, which then always say that the 20-year-old potential recruits is in Buenos Aires here, right? Which may mean that he's in fact in the attic or something, but they find this plausible that a third in certain villages in the Basque Country, a third of the 20-year-old men are in the Rio de la Plata in 1851, which again is the beginning of this whole story, right? So basically, you get villages being emptied of the economically active population, which should have important consequences on what happens to wages and real estate in these places of origin. Again, like I said, so this is the moment when a third of the population are missing, and that's the beginning of this whole demographic history, which becomes much more extreme. All right, so the wage-rent ratio in places like in Argentina in particular falls dramatically, and in European countries of emigration rises, though I don't have it for Italy. Again, the prediction should be here, if we follow Piketty, that the outpacing of the return on capital over wages is the main driver of inequality. Argentina in the late 19th century becomes a massively unequal, much more unequal country than before, whereas Italy, for instance, should be on the opposite trajectory. It doesn't happen so much if we can trust these Gini indices, which again I haven't done myself, but built, but stolen from elsewhere. It happens a little, right? But nowhere nearly to the extent that Piketty would predict. Why do I think it doesn't happen to the extent that Piketty would predict? Because although he's right that the conditions driving inequality massively exacerbate in Argentina because of immigration, at the same time, this mass European immigration amounts to the large-scale import of a middle class, which, whatever you want to call it, masks or postpones or mitigates the massive increase of inequality. And I think this is exactly what can be shown even by zooming in on the history of real estate of this particular neighborhood that I looked at. So I eventually constructed real estate Gini indices of households, or by the household level, which between 1855 and 1870, which, like I said earlier, is exactly that moment of Black dispossession in that neighborhood, rise a little bit when, for various reasons I won't go into, they should explode, and yet they don't. And the reason is that the actual house prices in the neighborhoods, because of the dispossession, become much more similar, right? So in the 1850s, you have extremely poor Black homeowners living next to owners that own houses that are worth 6 times as much. And in the course of the dispossession, the values sort of become even. So so basically the dispossession process creates a marriage of equality, if you will, or an actual equality in terms of the value of these houses. The other way to show it is that basically the houses that are not retained in the family, or the properties that are not retained in the family between 1855 and 1870, increase a lot more in value than the houses that are retained, right? So basically, people lose, and in particular, Black homeowners lose their properties. The developers move in, the prices become higher and more even in the neighborhood, creating this marriage of equality and an actual statistical real estate value equality, which in fact rests on this process of Black dispossession I talked about. All right, I leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Michael. Just before we go to the Q&A, we have to apologise to the people who arrived from the other room. We don't know how it's happened, but there were 2 sets of information that went out to half of us ended up here and half of us ended up in Jeremy Bentham. And thank you very much for coming over and bearing with us despite that mishap. And we hope you got enough from Michael's talk, but it will all be available online if you want to catch the first half later. And of course, we're delighted to be able to have some Q&A now to expand on some of those points. I'll be keeping an eye on the online participants, of whom there are about another 15 or 20. So if any of them want to ask a question, please put your hand up online and I'll keep an eye out for that. But in the meantime, if anyone in the room has got a question for Michael that we can kick off with, that would be great. Yeah, right.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I have 2 questions. One is, as you mentioned, the sort of usual story of Italian Argentine migration is one of impoverished Italians. And as you've shown, there are actually a lot of them hold real estate. So I was wondering how you think that changes the sort of the literature and our understanding of that mass migration. And my second question is about this slide actually, and how, because the Gini coefficient shows inequality, it doesn't show as much of a difference as you would expect, because the lower house prices come up to the same price of that of their neighbors. But then where do the dispossessed people move to? And so how does then that affect, if you look rather than by a sort of community scale, what happens when you look across the city more broadly, and does that picture change? Because I presume then they become tenants.
So what was the last question?
So if the sort of dispossessed,
Where do they go?
where do they go? How does that affect this the sort of Gini coefficient if they become tenants? And how does it look when you change the sort of example you've given here is in one neighborhood? So what does that picture look like when you go to a city or a citywide Gini rather than a community-wide?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting and central questions. Let me start with the second one and then circle back to the right, because we have the slide here. All right, so first of all, with all these Ginis and all that stuff, right? It depends how and what exactly you measure. These are different, right? On the left here from these, right? So here basically I measure households, how much wealth do they own in real estate, which is the main thing people own in that neighborhood at that time, right? But in the city as a whole, in fact. This goes up a little. It mostly should go up massively, not so much because of the Black dispossession, but because you get so many Italian immigrants coming in who do not own real estate yet, right? So this is this is basically populated by a lot of zero values, which should have this column, which should have this column be much higher because of it, right? The reason it doesn't is because the actual values, right? If you just look at how much we don't look at people or households, but just the houses, right? How much like and so that's and they become much more worth the same. So that goes partly to your first question about Italian immigrants being poor. Poverty is a relative term, right? So I don't actually want to, and this is why I had this point about migration history and settler colonial studies and so forth, right? Which is a difficult term and so forth. But like you say, this used to be narrated in the way that Dirk Herder has called the Ellis Island approach to migration history, right? So super poor European immigrants arrived to make a fortune, and so what I want to say, well, no, this is, poverty is a relative thing. That guy is illiterate; he's not a rich guy, but in the local arrangement, he's actually the guy who ends up dispossessing in the course of this. So it's complicated. I don't want to say they are wealthy people, which they're not, but it's part of a larger process of dispossession. And the other question, where do they go, and how would this look different if I looked at the whole city? So there's a larger demographic history question about what happens to the Afro-Argentine population, right? And that was the initial thing that George Reed Andrews wanted to answer in this book that was published in 1980. I think he's mostly wrong because he claims it's all a statistical mirage and there was no demographic decline. And I go up and down these censuses and also parish books, and I can tell you there was clearly demographic decline, severe demographic decline, which mostly has to do with mortality in military conflicts and infant mortality. And so the Afro-Argentine population actually declines in absolute terms, but above all in relative terms because there's so many European immigrants coming in, right? So that's the story there. Where do they go? But when do they go? Because they're sort of increasingly. He's right, George Reed Anderson is right, that they are increasingly being difficult to see statistically in the censuses, largely because there's so many other people now, and that it's kind of hard to exactly trace what so there's ongoing suburbanization. So basically in the wake of, but this goes throughout the 19th century, they're constantly being pushed out of the city, or you can call it expulsion or something. And I also think it has to do with early slum formation, in particular two slums in the southwest and in the northwest of the city, where they don't become so much tenants as squatters. Yeah, so that would be my short answer. But I also it's a mixed story, right? So I also get people selling. And then they sell, and then they buy black homeowners who sell, and then I find them in another notarial document where they bought a new house further out for half the price, and presumably use the difference to settle a debt or consume it as a pension in old age, because that's the thing, right? They are homeowners, but they are extremely poor. Apart from these houses, they literally, and you can see it in the testaments. So they sell for consumption, sometimes sell to buy something cheaper, so they move downward on the property ladder and consume the difference.
There's questions coming in thick and fast online, so I'm going to give you a couple from there, if that's all right. So I'll give you Alexandra's one first because it's a technical question, which probably would only need a short answer, which is, what is the reference name of the later source valuation of the properties, and whether it was self-assessed or assigned by officials?
So it's assigned by officials, and these are all from the so-called contribución directa, which is a real estate tax. that is being levied by the municipality. And I essentially use the tax list from 1855 and the one from 1870, where the tax person walks through the street and then lists the name of the owner and assigns a value, which is the basis for the tax.
Thank you. And then from Tom Rath, who's slightly broader questions, say, I'd be interested to hear Michael talk about how this fascinating story fits or not into the concept of racial capitalism.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think he wants to talk about that, but no.
I don't know, because because I struggle understanding what or defining racial capitalism in a foolproof manner, and like Tom saw, it's still there in the talk, and then people dissuaded me from using the term because it's an effective term that everybody understands differently, and so I didn't delete it from the slide, but decided not to talk about it so much anymore. Look, I don't know. I mean, I feel that in Cedric Robinson's hands, it's that he actually talks. He actually uses it mostly when speaking about the exploitation of labor, and so labor, as you saw, was a lot less present in the talk to begin with than capital, right? So I'm not even sure if I use the term in his according to his definition. It's then come up a lot recently in the literature about slavery and capitalism, where again I think it's ill-defined, but it actually serves as a vehicle to talk about the relationship between slavery and capitalism broadly, right? But mostly what it's meant to signal is that slavery was important in order to fuel the rise of industrial capitalism, which isn't what I'm interested in mostly either, right? So I don't really know. I mean, I'm not against using the term, but I'm not exactly sure what it helps to illuminate either, except to vaguely gesture to the question of how history of capitalism has something to do with racism, which is the story here, right? Actually, one of the things I was more interested in initially, and increasingly am more interested in again, is what all of this has to do with the neo-institutionalist literature about Latin American economic history, which is, the way I understand it, largely about arguing that Latin America's long-term problem of development and growth has to do with inequality, and then it has to do with the lack of security of property rights, right? And so whenever I talk about this, people almost immediately think, all right, so the dispossession that can happen because people don't have the deeds, they don't have the titles, right? And this is another story about the lack of security of property rights. And yes, right, to some extent it is, because they're losing the property where at a moment when they, I think, no, it's not a good thing to lose the property. So in that sense, their property is not secure. But I don't know from a legal history viewpoint what exactly to do about the notarial documents or the laws in order to improve the security in the property rights, because they have the deeds, it's all there, right? Yeah, so that's an excursion away from the racial capitalism question, but I think that's what I'm eventually more interested
in. There is another question online from Rory. It's a very long one and a two-parter, so I might just see if anybody in the room wants to ask something first before I get into that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in your critique of Andrews and thinking more carefully about what happens to the Afro-Argentine, just to call them that for now, population. And I was thinking about Paulina Alberto's book. And she actually has an example of a family who ends up with a house from a former slave owner. So I found that part really interesting, that your examples also included that. And then they become kind of middle class, partly because they have this house. And then if I remember correctly, her narrative, it's a pretty Black neighborhood, but it kind of becomes very diluted like yours does. And it sounds like it's probably because people are being dispossessed. And eventually the family kind of loses their identity as Black or brown. They just, if I remember correctly. So over generations. And I'm wondering if that's sort of what you're seeing here as well.
The fact that people lose their identity as Black.
Well, there's like a combination of some families retaining property and doing pretty well for a while, but eventually also not really being defined as Black or brown over generations.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. So Paulina Alberto's case, I think, is
Really? Right,
this
the
house,
neighborhood.
right? So her work inspired me in part to dig deeper here.
Yeah.
Although she's much more she's focused on this one family, right?
Right.
Because
Because of their son, right? Yeah.
exactly, because the descendant then becomes a sort of
Character.
beggar celebrity on the
Right.
So but I mean her case isn't exactly saying that they lose their identity as Black, because in fact it's all about the one descendant's Blackness,
Right.
which she calls hyper visible,
Yeah.
right? And he's called El Negro Raúl, and then basically in the early 20th century, Black people become this exoticist spectacle for, right? So it's not exactly about losing in that case about losing the Black.
Right. I guess I'm just thinking about the rest of the family who have maybe a more sort of less famous kind of trajectory, but quote unquote respectable, and kind of it's and maybe they're the sort of exception to your rule, that they're one of those few families that retains their home.
Well,
in that sense, they're more at a par with some of their
they retain the home, right, until I think 1921, which is very late. So in that sense, they're different from the majority, and yes, they are more middle class than the average. And although the story of the eventual dispossession that she tells is very similar to right, so it's also an Italian immigrant that ends up with it. It's in the moment of the inheritance that the problem comes up, when everything becomes very complicated, right? Because they then have to bring all the documents about who's who, the baptismal records, and so forth, and then incur extremely steep legal costs, which the future buyer pays, but then ends up paying an absolutely risible sum for the actual transaction, and right, so in a lot of senses, the story is actually very similar, just later.
Interesting.
But I think that doesn't answer your larger question about what happens to Black identity at large, right? And it is true, like what she says and what George Reed Andrews says, that all manners of public records in the course of the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century, record race or color, as it is called, increasingly less and less and less and less. But it's different for different kinds of records, right? So for instance, in censuses, it's basically binary question, right? Does the census ask the color question, yes or no?
Right.
Increasingly they do not, but on one occasion they do, right? And then there's the question what happens in that, right? But so for instance, notarial documents very often or increasingly refrain from recording buyers and sellers or testators' race. And so for instance, one question in my case is, why do I have so many African born all the time?
Yeah,
even at that late moment, right? But I think it is in part because and other people, not only me, but me and other people have an easier time of identifying them, because African birth is African birth.
Right.
Right, whereas in the other cases, I have an unknown.
Right.
I could go into the details. Actually, the degree of underclassification isn't even that unknown to me because I've dived into the numbers so much.
Yeah.
But there's increasing underclassification.
Okay, I'll read Rory's question now from the online chat. Rory Miller said, very interesting, Michael. A couple of questions. One, having done some work on real estate tax registers in Lima circa 1860, I was surprised at the degree of female ownership of property across the city. Was this the same in Montserrat? And then secondly, there is presumably evidence of property transactions in Buenos Aires notarial archives, but it might depend on finding the right notary who dealt with the different ethnic communities in this area. Any evidence for sale and rental transactions in those files that might throw light on the issues you are discussing? I just recall stumbling across the archives of a notary in Lima who dealt mainly with Italian immigrants, and it threw a lot of light on the business relationships within that community.
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, women owners, yes, plenty of them. I would say 40% of the 1,600 properties that I specifically look at in that neighborhood and have traced one by one were owned by women. It depends on which demographic we look at, right? So among Black homeowners, there's many women, which has again to do with they're often being widows because the man died in the third conflict, right? So in general, in the Argentine population at large, there's more women than men, and also among the owners, although ownership is still slightly patriarchal, right? So among the population, men are overrepresented among the owners compared to women. But yes, I do get a lot of women owners. I get very few women owners among European immigrants. Although there again, among the immigrants, there's a lot fewer women than men. So, but even beyond the demographic composition, I think the immigrant population is more patriarchal in its ownership, in its attitude to ownership, than the Argentine, including the Afro-descendant population is. And yeah, I look at notarial archives and notarial documents all the time. The problem with these is that unlike what Rory seems to have found for Lima, they do not, none of them, so there's about 10 notarial offices, and none of them serves a particular neighborhood or a particular demographic. Right, so it's completely all over the place, and so you have these tomes that list all the notary's transactions in a year, which can be obligations, mortgages, transactions, testaments, proxies, and so forth, organized by the date. And then you have an index, which is organized by the surnames of the sellers, for instance, and the testators. And to filter out Afro-descendant owners from that is difficult, because like I said earlier, they don't consistently racialize people. So you have to find a different way, and that's why I use compraventas, so notarial documents of real estate sales and purchases, less than other kinds of documents. Unless, and that's what I often do, right? So I know the owner from the census and from the tax list. And from another census, I know the racial designation of the owner, right? And then I look for the testament, and then I look for the probate court proceedings. And in the testament, it then says, well, I first purchased the property from so-and-so in the year so-and-so, and that was documented by the notary so-and-so. And then I go back and pick out the original purchase to see to whom the property belonged earlier, right? But that's the way of doing it. Because otherwise, if you go through the indices of all the notaries of the entire city and try to filter out people by race, it's not really possible. And by the way, one other thing is I try to so basically, I mean, I have been reading historiography of real estate for other places like Alexia Yates' book on Paris and Desmond Fitzgibbon's book about 19th century Britain, who always talk about how in the course of the 19th century, real estate became increasingly commercialized and viewed as a commercial goods that could be traded, right? Which apparently in the early 19th century wasn't so much the case in Britain yet. The annual volume of transaction in Buenos Aires in the 1830s is very similar to London today. So, so people buy and sell real estate all the time. So I don't really understand in this particular context what it means that only in the course of the 19th century real estate is being commercialized. I see people buying in May and selling in June, right? So that's a different, but I guess to Rory's question in the sense that there's just so much notarial documentation that I can't possibly, which is also why I can guarantee you they own it, right? And it's a notaries who document it. It's not an issue of squatting or informal or people doing stuff between themselves without the state. No, it's formal.
Another one coming online from Alejandra saying, can you distinguish in the valuation register between the properties which are rented from the ones which are owned, i.e. and inhabited by owners? And once again, can you give the name and reference for the second valuation? I couldn't hear it, thanks.
So the name
and reference for that second valuation, the 1871.
Yeah, so the evaluation is always a tax list for real estate taxes, which in Spanish is called contribución directa. And so in the 1855 case, it's straight from the archive. I think I showed you the handwritten thing. The 1870 version is a typewritten book, which is online. So if you just Google Registro de la Contribución Directa, 1870 Buenos Aires, you get to the book where every single owner is listed. And so the other question
is, can you distinguish in the valuation register between the properties which are rented from the ones which are owned?
No, I can't. But since I constantly cross-reference different kinds of sources, so on the one hand, I have the tax list, which just supposedly shows the address, although address actually, they don't have house numbers in that neighborhood, right? So it just is the street name and roughly the place, and then the person goes down, and then I count houses so I know which one it is, right? But it doesn't tell you the purpose of the property. It just tells you supposedly the address or where it is, the name of the owner and the value. That's all there is in the contribución directa. However, in order to figure out which house exactly it is, I read that in parallel to the 1855 census, which lists all the inhabitants of every single house. And with every inhabitant tells you the relationship that this inhabitant has to the head of household. So there it says dueño or propietario, or conversely inquilino, or esposa del inquilino, and so forth, or nieto del inquilino, and so forth, right? So via the census, not the tax list, I can distinguish between property between properties that are tenant occupied and properties that are owner occupied. That's the whole problem, like she probably hints at for the racial statistics, because my method is such that I can identify the race of the owner almost only if the property is owner occupied, right? And not if an absent landlord owns it. The absent landlords are overwhelmingly white, right? Which is why my method undercaptures white homeowners, and why I may overestimate a little bit black home ownership rates. I don't know if she was getting at that, right? But that's a bit of a problem. But even figuring that in, right? So it's only about 25% of the properties that are tenant occupied, and in that neighborhood even a little less. So it doesn't mess with my data to such an extent that I actually end up with really higher white ownership rates than black ownership rates. And the tenant occupied properties are more valuable per square meter than the owner occupied properties.
It's just extraordinary watching you talk about it. Is this map 3D in your mind? And are you looking at these houses and knowing who lives in?
It's actually not 3D because it's all flat. It's all one story. There's nothing.
But you can look at these houses and you immediately think, oh, that one's a mud hut and that one's a tenement. And that
Actually, the map is wrong, right? Because no, because the map is drawn by hand on the basis of the 1870 cadastral map, right? But here it's all the houses in their 1870 shape that are present in the tax list and the census of 1855. But the shape changes, right? So the so-called ranchos de paja, which are so these ones here, right? For instance, here they are in the 1855 census. They're black-owned properties, ranchos de paja, but they're not actually. I don't think they're actually adjacent to the street, right? It's they're being expropriated, and then the building structure changes also. So the map misrepresents a little bit the exact building structure, but it's not so much I can do that.
Yeah.
Any final questions before we get on?
It's a bit hard to ask you a question when you come halfway through, so forgive me, you've already talked about this, but and maybe it's not relevant, maybe it's too early, but there are Afro-Argentine publications on there.
Yeah.
So I suppose I'm wondering if they are any help to you, if they give any clues about attitudes towards this process, if they help you to, is there any kind of resistance to what is happening? Is it purely market, or is there something else going on there? I guess it's my question.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I haven't spoken about this, and I don't know to what extent I can, but I've been looking through these. They're also digitized and online, and it's remarkable how little they speak about this. First of all, right? But
that's quite interesting in itself.
It's quite interesting in itself, right? But so for instance, George Reed Andrews looked at these, and he says, okay, so they never speak about demographic decline, and hence, if there had been, then that must have been. But they're just very interesting and in a lot of ways counterintuitive publications to begin with, right? Many of them short-lived, many of them not instantly discernible as Black publications unless you know, right? So the language in which issues of racism and politics at large is being put on the table is very often guarded and hedged and really. And a lot about social events, tertulias, right? And we went to the houses, and then odes to the beauty of women and very poetic stuff. And if it is political, it is very party political, right? So Mitre versus Alcina, that kind of stuff. But very rarely in relation. So one issue that, for instance, comes up, which is tied into this, is they sometimes speak about Black education.
Yeah.
To what extent? To what extent should we get Black schools? And then they discuss that, right? And one group says yes, we should, and the other one says no. You just served fine by state schools, and let's not do this. In the course of that discussion, they often talk about how kids of Black mothers are being given away into white households in some sort of perpetuation of quasi-slavery, right? And that has a lot to do with my inheritance issues, and also with so basically, for instance, sometimes I build age gender pyramids, and you can see how the children are missing at the poor outskirts where the Black properties, and then you have an excess of Black children in the white center of town, right? And it breaks the family relation and therefore prospects of property transmission and things like that. So these things are going on. One interesting thing that's not one newspaper editor is Tomas Platero, who's something like the prodigal son of this neighborhood, who's a notary by profession, right? And so he's all about so he's constantly in my notarial documents at a later moment in the 1870s, right? But I found it interesting that the neighborhood's most famous son chooses notary as his but maybe just anecdotal. But
And the Italian one?
I haven't looked at it so much yet. You mean in terms of specifically debating how can we target or just
Discussion of the neighborhoods and,
yeah.
I don't know, I mean, I don't know if there was a Liguria. Quite like.
Yeah, there's so many short-lived, there must be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about the Italians, or at this moment, mostly Genoese, right, or Ligurians, they don't actually concentrate in any, so it's not like they specifically go to this neighborhood. So they wouldn't, I'm not sure to what extent the Italian press at that moment would be sort of turf oriented.
Okay, we better draw to a close as we're almost at 7 o'clock. Apologies again for the miscommunication about the room, and thank you for the extra effort those of you put in for the walking over here. If you could join with me in the traditional way to thank our speaker, Professor Michael Goebel.